Esther chapter 2. I just want to say this up front. It's kind of interesting that I looked at this title, Position in the Palace, and it dawned on me that there's another message that you've probably heard me preach called Position in the Palace with Joseph. And then it dawned on me how many times God puts his people in pagan places, positioning them high in the palace to influence people. Daniel, Joseph, Esther, and Mordecai we're going to look at today, among others. It's kind of interesting, all right? So as we go to Esther 2, we're going to read it in a minute, but I want to start out by talking about the idea of strategic planning and positioning. And as I was thinking about this whole thought this week, I was thinking about what would be a good illustration to help us understand the idea of strategic planning and positioning. And God brought me to this illustration about the game of chess, right? I don't know about you. I'm not a huge chess player. I'm not a very good chess player, which is why I've stayed away. But I've watched people who are really good at chess in different situations. And if you watch any of these professional matches between them, you'll understand what I'm talking about when this idea of strategic planning and positioning. The repositioning their pieces, they're always thinking ahead, right? They're always thinking ahead about actually, a good chess player, I was told, will be thinking 7 moves ahead, right? Think about that's incredible. I don't know about you, but sometimes I wonder if I can think 1 step ahead. Right? And then I thought about a real practical illustration for Whiting Community Baptist Church. What the Lord, I believe, wants to do here in our midst. And I think about the fact that he brought me here as the pastor. Why did he bring me to Whiting? What was his reasoning for that? And I'm watching how God is bringing even new people into our midst. And thinking about God maybe positioning and doing some strategic planning of his own. And what's interesting is God is the original strategic planner. I want to share with you just a quick scripture. You can write it down, Acts 17:26. This is where Paul is preaching in Athens to the Areopagus. And he's preaching to a group of people who are worshiping a God, an unknown God. And in the middle of his message, listen to what he says. Listen to the truth that he shares with them. It says in verse 25, nor is he served by human hands as though he's needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation. God, did you understand that you live where you live? You were born where you were born. You were in that family that you were born into, not by accident, but because God is a strategic planner. He's a positioner. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's the master chess player. God is the sovereign one over the universe who is moving chess pieces around in such a way that his plan will ultimately come about. Do you believe that, church? Do you believe God is that sovereign? Right? I believe he is. Whether you do or not, I do. I believe he is based on Scripture. Right? And then I want you to think about the story in Esther. And I'm gonna read it to us in a minute. But before I go there, I want to read Ezra 1:5. Ezra 1:5 sits in this whole story, as I've shared from your timeline that you have in front of you. But in Ezra 1, we see that God moved on Cyrus, on this king, this Persian king, Cyrus of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord, right? To bring them back to Jerusalem the way he had promised Jeremiah. And what Daniel had been reading at the end of, the 70 years of captivity, God would stir Cyrus to send them back to Jerusalem. But what's interesting, in verse 5, it tells us who ended up going to Jerusalem. It says, then the heads of the fathers' households of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites arose even everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. Which means that not everybody goes back to the land. Not everybody goes back to Jerusalem. Now, don't you think they would want to? Don't you think after 70 years of being in captivity and being punished for their sin, they would all want to go back? But the Bible tells us in God's sovereignty, he stirred certain individuals to go and others he didn't. Have you ever wondered why Esther and Mordecai are still in the Persian Empire? Why they're not back in Jerusalem? Well, because we're going to see in the text today, I don't believe God stirred them or their families to come back. Why? Because he has a reason for what we're going to see in the story, okay? All right. God has plans and purposes in his divine providence, okay? So what I want us to do, I want us to think about is I read through the Esther 2, and I want to read it, and I want to read it all together and then go back and look at it. What do we learn about God's positioning in the palace of both Esther and Mordecai? And I want us to see God's sovereignty. So join with me, listen to the story. It says, after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem and to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in the place of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem, and the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the command and the decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa, into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best palace in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Now when the turn of each young woman came to go into King Ahasuerus, after the end of the 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of her beautification were completed as follows. Ladies, would you like this? 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with spices and cosmetics for women. The young lady would go into the king in this way. Anything she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in the morning, she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shagaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now in the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king. She did not request anything except that what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the woman, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Now what I want us to do is look at this text, and there's actually 7 points that I want to share with you, and I'm not going to share a lot about each. And if you picked up, there was a handout that I put that gives a little bit of the timing of what's going on, particularly in verse 1. It'll help you to better understand the historical background to what's happening. So what do we learn about God's positioning in the palace of both Esther and Mordecai? These are Jews. These are exiled Jews who end up in the palace. So let's look, and I want us to see God's sovereign hand over this whole story. All right, let's look first of all in verse 1, the pondering time. We read that the king's anger had subsided. And I believe his anger subsided, and he was now in his right mind. Why? Because he's no longer under the influence of alcohol, we're told. Right? So he's now in his right mind, and he continues to remember, and I think possibly even regret, what he had done to Vashti in that particular rage that he was in. We see that back in 1:19, okay? Now, it's interesting. If you look at what happens in the timeline to him, okay? So if you look at your timeline from last week, we discover that he's put into power, raised up in 486 BC, okay? By the time we get to the feast of Vashti, where she's deposed, that's 3 years later. It's 483 BC. And remember last week I told you that more than likely the reason why he was throwing this big banquet was to have military strategy with his advisors, because he was planning to go into Greece to invade. Now, if you look on the timeline and you look at the sheet that I gave you this morning, he actually doesn't begin his campaign until 480 BC, which means that he's probably still strategically planning after he deposes Vashti. So he's got 3 years to strategically pose. Then he goes in 480 BC, and he begins these series of battles. By the way, one of them in 480 BC is called the Battle of Thermopylae. How many of you have ever seen, there's a TV show called The 300, or a movie called The 300. It's about the Spartans in Greece. It's about the story about how he had gone to Thermopylae and was going to conquer Greece, but because of the way the Spartans had positioned themselves, they actually had been able to take out like 20,000 of Xerxes' men, and they only lost a few. Now, eventually, he wins a little bit, and then he eventually comes back in 479 BC, okay, in a defeat. According to this timeline here, the one I gave you this morning, 480, he withdraws his alliance, the Sparta, and then in 478 BC, basically he's done with his campaigns, right? He will not be the last king of Persia. There will be, if you look in your timeline, there will be other kings. But he's done with his military conquests. By the time he comes back in 479 BC, he's been defeated, his tail between his legs, right? And he comes back and he begins to build all this stuff. So he's gone from being a military campaigner to 479 BC. He's now settled in, and he's going to die about 14 years later. Historically, okay? So he doesn't have much time left on the scene. So he comes back, and he's got this pondering time of what he's done, okay? So he's got 4 years, right? And a major defeat by the Greeks to ponder this. And how do we know that? Because if you jump ahead to 2:16 in our text this morning, it talks about the timing is the 7th year of his reign. And how did we begin the book of Esther? In the 3rd year of his reign. So we know by the time we get to 2:1, 4 years have passed. Okay? Probably 3 years continuing to strategically plan, and then a year or so of campaigns where he actually is defeated and comes home. And he's got time to think. Right? As he's thinking to himself, uh-oh, what have I done? That's his pondering time. So watch what happens next in 2 through 4. We've got the proposed tactic. So he goes to the king's attendants, right? The king's attendants who served him actually say to him, they realize that Vashti's off the scene. He hasn't had a queen in 4 years. So they come to him, his attendants, probably more than likely the very ones who were his advisors back in chapter 1, come to him and say, King, we know you've got an issue. Here's what we're going to propose for you. Okay? So, and what's interesting is, they propose, look for these beautiful virgins across, the 127 provinces. Let the king appoint overseers in the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa. So we're going to go out, we're going to find all the eligible young ladies who have never been married, right? We're going to bring them to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women, and then they're going to begin a year-long beauty treatment. They're going to begin to get ready to go in before the king. And I'll say this up front. Later on in the text, it tells us, you had one shot with the king. If you were going to be queen, you had one shot with the king, right? And if he liked you, he could call you back. If he didn't, basically, you were brought in. You weren't released to go back. Okay, you can go back to your former life. Under Persia, you would have been brought into the harem, and that's where you would have spent the remaining days. Okay? So these women are probably excited that they get the potential to be the queen, but if they don't get to be the queen, guess what? They get to be in the harem the rest of their life. Okay? So this is a risk-reward kind of thing for them. Okay? So he's bringing them in. And they're suggesting that he do that. So verse 4, let the young lady who pleases the queen be in the place of Vashti. So the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. So he listened to what they had to say. And it's interesting, under this particular reign, choosing a queen could have happened other ways. Could have happened other ways. And any other kingdom where there wasn't such freedom among the people for the king, he probably would have picked one of his own. And as I went back and I historically studied this is a unique situation because nowhere else had any of the kings picked a woman who was not Persian. You see in the providence of God, the hand of God? Because he makes this an open competition, Esther has an opportunity as a Jew to become queen, right? See God's hand in all of that. This is amazing, right? God was working through the attendants. He was working through these men to make this proposal. You see God's sovereign hand then, right? It wouldn't have happened in any other kingdom but here. And what was really interesting that I noticed as I was going through the text, she wasn't screened for her heritage. She wasn't screened nobody asked her, what's your nationality? And a couple of times in the text, we see Mordecai even says to her, don't tell anybody you're a Jew. Why? Because if you go back to Ezra 4:5 and you look at this historically, there's conflict going on in Jerusalem over the Jews. The enemies are opposing God's people even in Jerusalem. Can you imagine if she lets it known that she is a Jew? Right? So you see God's sovereign hand over this whole thing. So you see the proposed tactic that's going on there in verses 2 through 4. Now watch this. In this whole process, as we watch God's hand move, we see next in verses 5 through 7 and then 10 through 11, we see introduced what I'm going to call the providential trainer. The providential trainer. So you've got Esther introduced, or Hadassah, okay? The word, by the way, I was telling Mike this earlier, the word Esther, we think it's a good Hebrew name. It's not. It's a pagan name. It means Ishtar. By the way, do you know what Ishtar is? Ishtar was one of the goddesses that they worshipped, right? And Ishtar is where we get our name Easter, right? The goddess of fertility, Ishtar. her real biblical name was Hadassah, okay? But it's interesting that she's given this pagan name, Esther, right? Okay? And we see introduced in this story now in relation to her is Mordecai. By the way, he says here, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai. Now, the word Mordecai is a pagan name. We don't know what his Jewish name is because it's not revealed here. But Mordecai, they believe, stems from the name Marduk, who was one of the Babylonian gods. So if you look at these guys, just like what happened in Daniel, when these guys are brought into this new culture, they're given new names, okay? To try to incorporate them into the culture, right? Right? So we've got Mordecai who enters into the scene here, right? And it says he was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, verse 6, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of exile of Babylon, had exiled, right? So he was brought. Now it's interesting. If you look at the text carefully, and if you don't read it right, it sounds like Mordecai was exiled from the land into Jerusalem. But if you go and you do the timing of historically, that would make Mordecai 114 years old. And it would make Esther probably in her 80s, as the commentator said. Well, more than likely, Esther is not going to be a young virgin and not going to be in a place where the king is going to want to marry an 80-year-old. No offense, ladies who are older. No offense. Okay, this guy's a fairly young king, and so what if you read the text carefully, what it looks like is that it was actually Kish who was exiled. And Kish would have been the great-grandfather of Mordecai, his father being Jair, Shimei being his grandfather, and Kish, who is a Benjamite, being his grandfather. So that they were the ones who were in exile, right? Brought in, which means, if that's the case, and if we do our timing right, Mordecai and Esther were born where? They were born in Persia. They were born in the kingdom of Persia. They weren't exiled, so they didn't know what it was like. They were brought into Babylon and now are under this rule, okay? And it's interesting, I want to just point out historically, the idea of a son of Kish, a Benjamite, becomes really important later on, because when you see the phrase Kish, a Benjamite, you think of who historically that came before him. Saul, King Saul. And by the way, King Saul is going to be significant in the next chapter when we get to Haman historically. And you're going to see why Mordecai does what he does in chapter 3. It isn't accidental. It has to do with his lineage here, being basically an ancestor of Saul, King Saul, okay? So it's interesting. So in a sense, Mordecai comes from a royal line, right? And so we're told that he's... Verse 7, he's bringing up Hadassah. He's bringing up Esther, his uncle's daughter, which would make him what? And for years, I couldn't figure this one out. If it's his uncle's daughter, I mean, my brain gets slow sometimes. If it's his uncle's daughter, what relation is he to her? They're cousins, right? Probably an older cousin, right? Who's taking the place of her as a father figure, right? Why? Because we're told that she has no father or mother, that something happened to her mom and dad, right? And so they're now off the scene, and he's bringing her up as his own. And it tells us the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay? So what we've got going on here in this text, I believe, is we have the Lord has the right person giving her advice. One who was in the lineage of Saul, right? He's going to give her instruction. Look at what it says in 11 and 12. So jump just quickly down to 10 and 11. Listen to what it tells us about Esther. They're interwoven in the story, right? Esther did not make known her people or her kindred. I've already talked about that. For Mordecai had instructed her that she would not to make them known. So he's advising her. He's an advisor to her. right? And if young women are listening to this morning, do you have godly people that are older than you that are advising you and that you're listening to? Right? I hate to say it, but we live in a culture today, we live in a generation today where the kids want to throw off godly wisdom. They want to throw off those who know God's word, who are walking in God's ways, who have experienced life. They want to throw them off. But Esther is a godly young woman who's listening to the advice of her older cousin. Right? That's the way it should be. That's what the Bible teaches, that the older women should be discipling the younger women. The older men should be discipling the younger men. Why? Because we have knowledge of the Scripture. We have a knowledge of walking with God. We have an experience of life walking with our God, and we can help them. And that's what she was willing to do. She was a godly woman. And I'll say that simply because there are some people who I've heard preach, and some commentaries would say that she was ungodly. I'm going, no, she wasn't. She wasn't ungodly. She was a very godly woman listening to her godly cousin, right? So we see that in verse 10. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. So he was deeply concerned about her in all of this. Wanted to see how she was doing. Again, we don't know, but probably across the 127 provinces, there's probably at least hundreds of young ladies that potentially could be the new queen, right? It's like I was talking to Caleb the other day about becoming a pro football player. I said, what's the chance of becoming a pro football player? Guys, or a professional athlete of any kind? Very slim. Right? Because even among the elite in college, you've still got a lot of people for a few positions. And it reminds me of what's going on here. There's probably hundreds of women. What's the chance that this young lady is going to be the one that's chosen out of all of hundreds of women? Well, you'd say maybe not much until you see God's sovereign hand in the middle of all of this, okay? So that's what's going on. Then, jumping back to 8 and 9, we see what I am seeing in terms of God's sovereignty is the preferential treatment. Now, this is interesting, okay? It says, now the young lady pleased him. Okay, who's the him? Well, back to verse 8, it's Haggai. So she's brought into the custody of Haggai, the one who's over all of these women, right? Who probably, as a eunuch, he's trusted by the king in the king's eunuch. He probably has a lot of influence, right, among the king and among these women. So he's in charge of the harem, right? Okay? When the king heard that many young ladies were gathered to the Susa, he put them in the custody of Haggai, and Esther was taken to the king's palace into his custody, who's in charge of the women. Verse 9, now the young lady pleased him. Who? Who's him? Haggai, right? And found favor with him. You can already beginning to see that God is turning the tables so that Esther would be assured to be the queen. You seeing that? I don't know about you, but that gets me excited to know that God is weaving his hand, his sovereign hand through this and working it in such a way that she finds favor with this guy who's in charge of the king's harem. This is just an absolutely amazing story of God's providence. Okay? Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. Verse 9, so he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther is shown favor by Haggai, right? All who saw her basically saw that she was beautiful, and eventually we're going to see coming up that the king will see that she's beautiful. See, I believe the Lord had given her something on the outside as well as the inside that endeared her to people and people to her. Remember what we saw about Vashti? Vashti was beautiful, right? But what was the recommendation in chapter 1? Even before he goes to battle, you need to find one who's as beautiful as her and even more beautiful than her. Because what we're going to see about Esther is not only was she beautiful outwardly, but she was beautiful inwardly. Her character. So when Vashti got deposed, king wasn't losing anything. Actually, the king was going to gain as God rose her to prominence, and she would become the kind of queen that would please him eventually, right? Okay, so what happens here is crucial, because if she's not chosen, the consequences are deadly, right? This was, I believe, God's sovereign hand working through Haggai. Look at 15 through 18. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who was taken as his daughter, came to the king. So when Esther comes to the king, she doesn't request anything. She doesn't request anything, but everything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, right, advised. And what we see in 15 is that she's prudent in all of this. Esther could have had anything she wanted to get herself ready to go to the king. This is where I think you see her godliness. But what does she do? She listens to whom? She listens to Haggai, his advisor. By the way, who would know the king better than anybody in relation to what was about to happen and choosing a new queen? Haggai would, right? He's got to have relationship with the king, right? He's probably constantly in communication with the king, particularly through this whole process of choosing a king. So he's one of his trusted men that she trusts and listens to his advice, right? She knew that he knew the king well, better than he did, and so she listened and trusted him, right? And it's interesting when you go back to verse 10. It says that, okay. So continuing on, right? So we see that the young lady would go in, verses 12 through 14, each day, right? Each lady would go into the king, and at the end of the 12 months, so there's been a year of preferential treatment. There's been a year of getting the women ready to go into the king, right? Can you imagine that, women? You're going to the king. You're going in. I'm thinking about like American Idol. I'm thinking about some of these shows where they have to go before judges and they want to go in at their best, right? This is for the prize here is to be the queen of the kingdom, right? So they've got a year's time to get ready. They're getting them ready with all these beauty treatments to go in before the king, because you've got one shot with the king in verse 12, right? It says, when each their turn came to go in, at the end of the 12 months under the regulations for women, the days of beautification were completed. 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with spices and cosmetics for women. The young lady, verse 13, would go into the king in this way. Anything she would desired was given to her from the harem for the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shagaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and was summoned by name. He would have to summon her by name. So you know that if you got the call back, how many of you have ever been in an interview situation where you're hoping, you did my interview go well and all that kind of stuff, and if you got the call back, you know you had a chance, right? Same thing here. If you didn't get the call back, you were going to be stuck in the harem for the rest of your life. If you got the call back, there was a possibility that you could find favor with the king and be the queen one day. Absolutely amazing, okay? So Esther was taken, verse 16, and we saw in 15 that she found favor in all the eyes who saw her. The Haggai, all the people saw the beauty of her, right? So she's taken to the king to the royal palace in the 10th month in the 7th year of his reign. Okay, that would have been 4 years after Vashti was deposed. Actually, 5 years after Vashti was deposed, because you have to account for that year-long getting ready to go visit the king. So it's been 5 years. Look at verse 17. It says, then the king loved Esther more than all the women, And she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gives a banquet, Esther's banquet for all the princes and servants, and he makes a holiday and gives gifts according to the king's bounties. Really, verse 18 is what we would call today what? After the wedding. Right? There's a celebration. There's a reception, right? He's throwing a banquet for his new queen. It's really, really interesting, right? And it says that when the king saw her, he was pleased with her. It's interesting. The word pleased in the Hebrew is the same word as was made merry in chapter 1, verse 10. Isn't that interesting? Did you know that? Made merry, pleased. Same Hebrew word. Now think about it. Put the connection together. What was it that pleased the king in chapter 1? What pleased him? The wine, to be made merry. What's pleasing him here? Her. Her. He's made merry with her. He's so pleased with her. This is interesting, right? Absolutely amazing. Okay, and then what's interesting, so think about this. What's the chance that without God's sovereign hand, that a Jewish exile ends up becoming the queen of Persia? Think about that. This is a Jewish exile. This is one that was put into captivity because of Israel or Judah's sin. He's a commoner, right? And like I said, I went back historically and looked. Nowhere in the records of Persian queens ever, before or after, was a commoner ever made queen in Persia. Wow. I mean, does that wow you at all? That doesn't happen without God's incredible sovereign hand. And then I want us to see the last thing here, which I think is really critical to the continuing story. Again, why did I say position in the palace? Why did I talk about Mordecai and Esther being positioned in the palace? Because they both are going to play a significant role. Not just Esther as future queen, but Mordecai is going to play a significant role. And when you understand what goes on here, you'll understand what's going to happen in chapter 3 and beyond, because it all is tied together. The whole story, all the sovereign details go together. Look at verses 19 through 22. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, okay, we don't know why they were gathered together the second time. This would have been after she was made queen. But we find out that at that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, some people will say, well, why was Mordecai sitting at the king's gate? Was he a commoner, just a Jew who was a commoner who happened to be sitting at the king's gate? Or is it possible that he had some kind of elevated position because of her? We don't know. It's possible because oftentimes when you were sitting at the gate, you usually carried a position of authority. But even if that's not true, why would he be sitting at the gate? Because he was concerned about Esther, and he was going to watch to see what was going to happen with Esther, right? Because he was her guardian. He still was concerned for her. He was still caring for her. And we're going to find out later on that even though she's a married woman now, she's going to come back and she's going to listen to Mordecai, because Mordecai is basically her father figure, the one that raised her, the one that would have trained her. And the Bible doesn't tell us this, but if he's a godly man, he would have been instructing her in the ways of God. So there's still that connection there, right? So he's sitting at the gate, right? And again, verse 20 tells us Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons in verse we looked at already, one of the reasons why he doesn't tell beforehand is because she's Jewish, because that could affect things, because the enemies, they hated the Jews even back then. Now here, even though she's the queen, she's not telling, and the reason we're going to see that is later on in terms of the story. So she's not telling now because God is sovereignly in control of her concealing that at this point. And it's going to be needed later on, but not right now. Okay? Esther did what Mordecai told her as she had done when under his care. So she's still listening to him, verse 20. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, you've got these two men, two of the king's officials, who guarded the door, which means they probably would have had access to the king at some point, who they guarded the door. And what does it say? Somehow the king made them angry and they wanted to lay hands on him. Now, historically, if you do some reading about the character and the personality of this king, he wasn't always pleasant, right? He could have done something. We don't know, the text doesn't tell us, but whatever it is, he's done something to make these men angry. And these men, because they guard the door, have close access to the king, right? And could probably have access to lay hands on him, to kill him in a way that the commoner wouldn't, okay? This becomes incredibly significant to the story, right? And then you continue on. But the plot became known to Mordecai, right? And he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. So she goes, right? And verse 23, it's interesting. I love the way the text reads. Now, when the plot was investigated and found to be so, right? I mean, you can make an accusation against somebody, but when their life is on the line, right? Because they're going to lose their life here. You want to make sure you've investigated this thoroughly. I mean, you don't put somebody on trial with no substantiation of the fact that they did something and then send them to the gas chamber, or stick a needle in them and lethally inject them. You don't do that. So they're doing what was right. They investigated. They found out all the reports were true. And what do? They were both hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. Let me just say this. The book of Chronicles that's listed here is not the book of Chronicles in Scripture, right? It would have been the chronicles that the kings would have had. They would have had these history books, these chronicles of major events that they would have had written down, all the major things that happened in the kingdom, okay? Every kingdom would have had some kind of chronicle or some kind of detailed outline of what happened in their kingdom, okay? But what's significant here, okay, Mordecai's position, because of his concern for Esther, puts him in the right place to expose the plot against the king, which will come back later on. And when she goes into the king to tell him about these two men, they end up executing. But she says Mordecai was the one that reported to her. That becomes significant later on in the story. And okay, so I wanted us to see God's sovereign hand through this chapter. Are you seeing it? You see it? I mean, just look at all the places where, I mean, this whole idea of, even the 4 years after he comes back, he's at a place now where he realizes after this defeat, he's got no king, right? And look at how God stirs the advisors to say, hey, remember we told you, we recommended back 4 years ago, we recommended you replace Vashti? You haven't done that. You need to do that. Right? And their recommendation is not that you put a Persian woman on the throne, but let's open this up to everybody. That's God's incredibly sovereign hand. Then you see Mordecai being positioned for what God's going to do in the kingdom coming later on, right? And he's advising her, right? Then you see the preferential treatment. I mean, let's be honest. God was assuring with this preferential treatment, and you don't see this given to anybody else, any of the other young virgins, but only to her, right? And finding favor with this pagan eunuch as a Jewish young exile has got to be the hand of God. God was the one that gave her favor because of her beauty, not only outwardly, but inwardly. And then he gives this preferential treatment, which basically is assuring from God's perspective that she's going to get picked, right? She can't lose because God's in the middle of this, right? Even among all these other women. She's given everything. And then even the prudence that she takes, even the advice that she takes from Haggai, who knows the king better, is all God's providence. And then we're going to see even this whole plot that we see at the end of chapter 2. We're going to see God's providential hand, that Mordecai was the one that exposed the plot later on. So if you like a good story and you like a good plot, guess what's happening? It's beginning to crescendo, and it's really going to get good when we get into chapter 3. But as we close it out this morning, again, let me ask the question. What is the chance that without God's sovereign hand, that this Jewish exile ends up becoming queen from among hundreds of women, right? Because you got to know she wasn't the only beautiful woman in the kingdom, right? Because the recommendation was bring beautiful young virgins, right? So here she is lined up with probably hundreds of other incredibly beautiful women that the king could have chosen. He just happens to choose Hadassah? You think? I don't. I believe God's hand is in the middle of this. And as we reflect on the events of Esther 2, we see his hand completely in the details, and we understand that the same God is in control of the events of his people today. Do you believe that? Do you believe the God who is in control behind the scenes in Esther 2 is the very God that is behind the scenes sometimes controlling our lives? By the way, who would you want in control of your life, you or this God? Seriously. How does it go for us when we try to control our own lives? Doesn't go well, does it? But if we trust a God who is sovereign, like Esther and Mordecai we're going to have to trust, and we're going to find out later on, the entire Jewish nation is going to have to trust this God, because without this God, they will be annihilated. In our lives, are we going to trust ourselves, or are we going to simply allow God to work his will out in our lives and trust his control in our lives? I believe we have the same God. I don't know that there's anything in Scripture that would imply their God is different from our God. It's the same God, right? The Lord, he's in complete control. He had everything in place for his plan. And I'll give you some scriptures real quickly that go along with this. Daniel 4, 34 to 36 talks about God being in control. Isaiah 44, 6 and 7 talks about God's sovereignty. Isaiah 46:10, God's sovereignty. Proverbs 16:33 talks about God's sovereignty in our life. Has the Lord given you favor, preferential treatment, and a positional placement for his purposes? Think about this. If you walk away with nothing other than this today, if you walked in here thinking, you know what, I'm not really that important, right? And the world wants to beat us down. The enemy wants to beat us down. He wants us to think that we're nothing, that we mean nothing to this world, that if we were gone, we would be insignificant, we wouldn't matter at all, right? The devil tried to sell that lie to me before I was saved, right? And thank God I didn't buy it. But if you understand that you are a child of God, you are significant. And how is God showing favor in your life to those around you? Because he has a purpose and a plan for which he wants to use you. Do you believe that, church, today? Then start looking for where God is working and say, God, how can you use me? How do you want to use me? Right? He has positioned you for a purpose. Is the Lord working even through unbelievers to do his will where he has placed you? Look around you. Look around where God has placed you. Mike, he's put you over your little, Discover Little Miracles. What are you there for? Are you there just to provide daycare for children? Or does God position you there for something greater? Right? Christy, he's put you at the school. You understand that, right? Has he put you there just to be a math teacher? No, he's positioned you there, right? Nancy, even you're retired, right? Has God positioned you where George, you're retired. Has he positioned us where he's positioned us to use us among unbelievers? Do you believe that, church? And if that's the case, for such a time as this, because we're living in a day where God needs his people to be used of him, to allow them to control him in such a way, not in a puppetry sort of way, but to be led by him, to be used by him so that his kingdom can advance. Right? We're in a fight, but God has positioned us for a reason. And the question is, are we using the Lord's prudence to reach unbelievers? Do we have the prudence of Esther to reach unbelievers? Or are we going to be like a bull in a china shop like me sometimes when I don't agree with stuff on Facebook, especially political stuff? Am I going to go out there and just go crazy and ruin my opportunity to witness the gospel? Or am I going to use God's prudence by the leading of His Holy Spirit to reach unbelievers in a way that the other way wouldn't work? Am I going to listen to the prudence of wise counselors? Christy, just last week, we were talking about something, and I was planning to do something, and you came along, and you gave me wise counsel. And I listened to that wise counsel this week, and I believe it went well. Thank you for being used of God to speak to me, right? Are we going to be that, right? We're going to sing a song that I think ties in with this whole sovereignty of God.